Hello, and welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar. I'm your host, Robert Doar, and thanks for tuning in today. As president of the American Enterprise Institute, I have the unique privilege of working with America's greatest policy experts. These scholars focus on policy issues in the fields of education, economics, energy, foreign and defense, and so much more. Subscribe to this podcast for exclusive access to in-depth discussions on the most pressing policy issues. Together, with my guests, we'll challenge political preconceptions, explore innovative ideas, and create, I hope, a freer and safer world. This week, we have the great pleasure of having Christine Rosen with us, who is an daily experienced podcast participant. So I'm going to be totally outclassed in this conversation. She's also, if you talk to people who listen to that podcast, I don't know who sponsored it or what it's really about, but it's a podcast. It features other AEI scholars besides Christine. They will say their favorite guest is Christine. So Christine Rosen, welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about Christine's great new book. My wife tells me I use the word great way too often.
Oh, you can't. In describing the book, please, pile on.
It's really a wonderful book, and I can't say I've read the whole thing, but I've read excerpts of it and parts of it. The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World by Christine Rosen. It's coming out very soon.
September 10th.
Okay,
Yes.
It's going to be the book of the year, I think. I'm big on this book. And the reason is because it's addressing an issue that I think about every day. And that is what technology is done to human interaction, to our daily lives, the way we relate to each other. And I have 4 children. You have 2 children. Yours are a little bit younger than mine, but we've watched them grow up in this world. And we're worried about, and the way you put it is, you say the extinction of experience. I was going to say the theme of your book is that technology is ruining human experience. So am I right? Is that what your theme of your book is?
Yes, I would say I use the term extinction in part because extinction tends to be a process, right? It happens sometimes gradually. And I took the title actually comes from a man named Robert Michael Pyle, who was an environmentalist conservationist. And he worried about nature deficit disorder, this idea that if kids are raised in an environment where they don't have any hands-on experience with the natural world, they won't really understand when species go extinct or other things, disappear from the natural world. And it got me thinking about how there are a lot of things we no longer do as human beings, like sit down and talk to each other face to face as often as we used to, or learn how to write in cursive, and all kinds of basic skills that have just gradually disappeared, gone extinct, if you will. And we haven't really accounted for what that loss means. So I would say, we all use technology. It makes my job much easier. It makes a lot of things possible. But I think we're now at a point where, particularly with our smartphones and the internet and social media use, we're starting to have conversations that we should have had, I would argue, 20 years ago when these technologies first came out. But we're now having conversations about what's lost as well as what's gained in our use of these. So I really do I'm not a Luddite, although I'm often called one. I jokingly call myself one sometimes. But I use all these things too. I raise my kids trying to have some boundaries and rules with them. It's a challenge. And I think one of the reasons it's a challenge is that we've come to assume that we can't live any other way except with these mediating technologies. And I would argue in some areas of life we can and should.
Okay, but how could we have known 20 years ago to have this conversation? I mean, that phrase, let's have a conversation about, always drives me a little crazy. How could we have had that conversation 20 years ago? We didn't know that this all was going to happen.
So some of us started when social media, so I started writing about social media before Facebook in the MySpace era. And I started to see how I was interviewing lots of people who were heavy users of these technologies and these platforms, and I noticed some certain behavioral traits that came out, the kinds of behaviors that these platforms encouraged. And again, this was very early stuff. When Facebook came out, same thing. Everyone's like, great, we'll just connect with our high school friends. It'll be super great. And it was, I think, for a lot of people. But very quickly it became clear that the platforms were rewarding certain kinds of human behavior. So human beings haven't changed, right? Human nature is a thing. Conservatives tend to want to emphasize that in a world where everyone thinks we can transform ourselves. We can't transform human nature that much. So what these platforms started to reward were the sorts of behaviors anger, fear, anxiety, social competition, the sorts of things that then people would react to. So we started to see people performing online in ways that they didn't used to do in private life. It changed their real-world behaviors in fundamentally new ways.
Okay, you saw it coming, and others saw it coming, but most of us just were overwhelmed by it. But I'll get to that in a minute. Before we get into the specifics, I do want to introduce you to our audience. You are a resident scholar at AEI. You've been now 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
We are so proud and happy to have you. How did you get into this public intellectual world to begin with?
Well, I trained as a historian, got my PhD in American intellectual history, and after a brief stint looking around at academic jobs in history, ran happily into the arms of the public policy and think tank world here in Washington, D.C. I actually came to D.C. when I was still writing my dissertation and started doing some work, including with some AEI scholars, some research and writing. And that led, once I finished the doctorate, to the Ethics and Public Policy Center was the first think tank I worked at, and a group of us, including Yuval Levin, who's here now at AEI, and my boss at Social Cultural Constitutional Studies, to start a journal called The New Atlantis about technology and society. And that actually was the beginning of my thinking about bioethics issues. I'd done history of genetic science for my PhD, and thinking about how technology changes human behavior.
So you've been thinking about this for a long time and writing about it for a long time.
Yes.
Okay, so now let's just get to brass tacks about technology. So it's so funny that you said public intellectual history in the United States, and that immediately makes me think of Tocqueville and of course his public intellectual contribution to America was describing traveling around America.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in your book you talk every once in a while about the ways in which just traveling, just seeing where we've been and where we're going in moving around a geography has been tarnished or harmed by technology. Tell me about that.
Yes, I talk a little bit about some of the pleasures of life that we've sort of unthinkingly outsourced to technology. Now, some of these things have practical use. I just traveled up to the coast of Maine with my kids for a vacation, and I used GPS the whole way. I actually know the route now pretty well, but in case I got lost, I had GPS. GPS puts you on your smartphone, will put you at the center of the map, right? But you don't really see what came after or what comes before unless you zoom out. Reading a map, reading an old-fashioned paper map, finding your way is an important skill. I actually made my
getting
kids,
lost.
Yes, getting lost.
It's a pleasure.
You can't get lost anymore. Although when you do, if you're out of the service range of your GPS, it's much more terrifying, I think, for people than it used to be. And so I taught my kids how to read a paper map, which is what I grew up learning how to navigate things. And so again, that's a small skill. But I think it also speaks to the way we come to view the world because we have these technologies. So I don't.
But can I just interrupt you there? I think you're missing one thing that also happens, and this occurred to me. I did a little walking excursion in the District of Columbia this weekend. I walked from my home in Woodley Park up to the Lincoln Cottage, which is where President Lincoln had his summer. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty long walk.
It is a long walk.
And I, of course, used my smartphone to make sure I was following the right path. But as I did it both up and back, it occurred to me, I'm looking at the map. I'm not looking at where I'm walking.
What's around
and I'm
you.
not looking at what's around me. I'm not really experiencing this walk the way I should. And seeing people's faces, seeing the different architecture. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a fundamental problem. We're not seeing each other anymore.
Yes, and this is actually something that if you look at how people store memories of trips, for example, they'll take 1 million pictures. They rarely now, because we take so many pictures, it's so easy. We keep them on our phone. We can upload them to different platforms. We don't actually go back and look at them as often, and we don't curate them in the way that in the old days we all used to have photo albums. Remember, it was very laborious and expensive to go get the film developed, and then you put them in an album, and then everyone would sit around and look at all the pictures. So there've been a couple scholarly studies of how memory and how our retrieval cues, because of the ease of taking pictures, has changed the way we remember things. And so I think even as we're having experiences, we're mediating them. And then our memories of those experiences are preserved on platforms that are certainly capable of bit rot, disappearance, and that are actually not even owned. If you put your memories up on Facebook, Facebook owns those, not you, if you look at the fine print. So I think we've changed.
And they're very aware of my memories. They send me a little notice every day.
That's
saying,
how you remember the past, right? This is what you were
but
doing
I have
a
to
year
challenge
ago.
you about that because I definitely look at photographs of my family in my past.
Okay.
Much more frequently now because I've got them on my phone and I can scroll through them. And sometimes here at the wonderful American Enterprise Institute, I get a little lonely for my family and I get a little tired of all of you. And so I look at my pictures of my family.
Totally understandable.
And so it's actually easier. So on this score, I've got a whole list of these things, but this one is striking because, like, for instance, I have a new grandson.
Mm-hmm.
I am much more in touch with his life than I would be if it wasn't for technology. I see his face more often.
Mm-hmm.
He sees me, and we do a lot of FaceTime phone calls. And is that bad?
No. So this is where I would say it's only bad if it allows or encourages you to replace the in-person interaction with your grandchild, which I think for a lot of people is what ends up happening. So if you accept FaceTime is no substitute for being in his presence, holding him. Yeah. You see what he smells like, for good or ill.
Yeah.
You know, you get to interact. They have done studies of children looking at adult faces and with a screen, sort of a screen-based version and in person, and there are real differences in how their brain reacts to that. So I think we saw this with COVID too, with all the kids who had to do school on a screen. So I would say it's only dangerous when we start to replace rather than to use it as you are doing, as a useful tool to stay in touch.
Well, I actually am a little worried about it from his perspective because I just don't know what the impact of this frequent business of having his parents show his grandparents or friends on the phone and that's kind of a daily routine. They have some conversation where and you can see he looks at the screen. He's seeing me. You're seeing, but is that going to be good for him? And also the glory of imagination, of imagining what this person looks like. But it's always the reality's right in front of you through this screen. Maybe that's not good.
So one of the concerns is that there's a sort of on-demand mentality that we've all tended to develop, and kids who grow up, now you can. If there've been these studies where they show a kid a book, and the kid puts his finger on the page and tries to swipe the page because they're used to dealing and manipulating touch screens versus paper. I think, again, the concern is we don't have the long-term studies yet, but what we do know so far is that it is not a legitimate replacement for being in the presence of another human being. There are all kinds of bodily cues that we give off when we're face-to-face, and I ended up writing a whole chapter about face-to-face communication because I went down this rabbit hole of studying what it means to interact in that way. So if we were doing this via Zoom instead of together in a studio, we'd be having a different experience. Now, it might be just as productive and just as interesting a conversation, but I wouldn't be able to tell if you were getting annoyed or impatient. You wouldn't be able to tell if I was looking panicked about something in quite the same way.
Well, in the book, you tell a story, and you say, I was at a conference, and I had this interaction with this young man, and it really had a big impression on me. And what you describe is you say that this is getting to a more intimate relationship between men and women, of a young, probably freshman, sophomore in college, maybe a little uncomfortable with people in the opposite sex. And he had become a Facebook friend with a young woman in his class and his contemporary. And he had never really encountered her in person, in the flesh. Yes. And then when he did, he got very nervous and sweaty, and he drove him crazy, and he didn't know what happened. He wasn't used to this reaction since he thought he knew her.
Right.
And I think what you say. Well, why don't you tell us why did that happen to him?
So it was a fascinating conversation for me because he told me how he came to understand that he actually was attracted to this woman. He's like, I liked her because I'd seen her on Facebook and they'd had a few, little conversations via the screen. But his body reacted. Like he had a physiological response to being in her presence that was just like, I'm sorry, evolutionary psychology has a perfectly legitimate explanation for this, but he'd never felt that around other people. It was just a very strong reaction to her physical presence. And he was very sheepish. He's like, wow, I guess I really like her. And it was just, but what that told me is that he'd been raised, and I asked him, I said, are most of your friendships, do you text most of your friends or see them in person? He said mainly texting during high school. And he didn't actually know himself in that way well enough because he was able to mediate most of his relationships growing up. And that distance then surprised him when he was in the physical presence of someone he found attractive.
Now we're going to leave it a little more personal. The cell phone is so addictive, and you can become kind of compulsive need for that stimulant that comes from the most recent email or the newest news hit or anything, and what that can kind of upset your pre-dinner conversations with your wife.
For instance.
For instance.
Some might say.
and I found that I'm having a harder time listening to Sarah talk, and Sarah's charming and wonderful.
Yes, she is.
And what the heck is going on there? Am I alone in this concern?
No, this is the cell phone, the smartphone is basically a Skinner box, right? It gives you an intermittent reward system, whatever notifications you're getting.
Tell us what a Skinner box
B.F. Skinner, operant conditioning, the idea that, you give, that he would train these animals to give them a reward sometimes, and then they'd have to keep coming back, but they didn't know when they'd be rewarded, so they just kept coming back.
It encourages compulsive.
It does, and it's designed. Everything about the phone and the way it looks and feels, everything about it is designed to keep you wanting to come back, and particularly the platforms and messages that we all use. I think that your point about listening is really important, because I think what a lot of these platforms give us is a way to be heard, but not encouragement in how to listen or even training in how to listen. So when we think about these impacts, everyone can be heard. I could open up a Substack tomorrow and write my own newsletter. Everyone can see it. There are no barriers. In many ways, that's a good thing. There's a lot of freedom and opportunity and entrepreneurship that's grown from that. But we're not as good at listening, and we're not as patient. I have a whole chapter about waiting. We are not used to waiting. And when we do face inconveniences in life, which still happen, you sometimes have to wait for stuff, whether you're waiting outside someone's ER room hoping they're okay, whether you're waiting for a bus, whether, and as we get older, our physical bodies will decline and things will happen that we can't control. And it's that worries me, that we have lost the ability to deal with those sorts of situations.
Okay, so we've talked about children and grandparents and husbands and wives trying to listen to each other, but let's get to something a little more juicy. Sex. And let's particularly talk about as a subject that you and I know something about, because we both grew up and we raised young men and women that went through adolescence. We have other scholars that have said that there's been a kind of decoupling.
Yes.
Young men and women are not enjoying the pleasures of each other the way you and I did when we were young. Is that true?
Yes.
Or is that just a myth that I've created?
No, that's true.
Okay.
So Dan Cox, my colleague, is actually going to write a whole great book about this. But the data show they're not having as much sex. So they're very cautious. But the most heartrending thing is to listen to them talk about trying to meet people, trying to connect, trying to find that special someone. It seems they talk about it like they're in battle almost. They have to go through the dating apps. They get rejected. The way they're rejected, the number of people. So on the one hand, there's limitless opportunity. On the other hand, it's the tyranny of choice, right? If you have endless choices, you're never really satisfied with the thing you pick, because there's always something better out there possibly. So the way that forms, again, worldview, it's the habits of mind that we're training an entire generation to expect, which is you have to serve yourself up on a platter and you have to look a certain way with certain selfies, with certain remarks and certain things, so the algorithm will funnel to you the people who you're most likely to either want to have a hookup with or maybe date. And there's this middleman now in these platforms, and I understand. I know a lot of people who've met through these online dating platforms, so I'm not trashing them, but I'm saying it changes the way we approach courtship. It changes our understanding of a compromise, and it really alters the way, it used to be. I have a friend who.
But aren't you skipping that it also gives a certain cheap pleasure?
Yes, of course.
So that it's, why do I need to go out and meet that ninth grader down the block? I can fool around with his phone and get whatever.
Well, and we're seeing.
And I'm not talking about pornography. I'm just saying stimulant.
Well, so in Japan,
or relationship.
Japan is a good example. They're already about a decade ahead of us on this. A lot of young men and women are opting for no relationships because they would prefer to have, whether it's a chatbot or an anime character or some. They feel connected.
Help me, God.
Some guy married someone from a video game in Japan. So, like, he legally got a certificate of marriage. So, and I think with the new AI chatbots and the relationship sort of conversational relationship chatbots that we'll see coming down the pike, that people will find that more appealing. It's easier.
So you
it's
also
easier.
have this. You do a little bit of a mild critique of Mark Andreessen on this topic.
You thought it was mild?
Yeah, it's pretty
man.
strong. And where
legal approved it. I'm just saying.
Well, no, but you quote him saying,
yes.
And I was thinking of Walker Percy when I read this, and it really is applicable. But Walker Percy was a contra to this. He says, well, most people's lives are so boring and unpleasant and terrible that technology's bringing them something that they never would have. And then there are the few of us that are sophisticated enough to have real relationships and really understand the glory of humanity. But, we've had the great unwashed, as Rui Teixeira referred to them last week in a podcast. They get technology and they're better, and the rest of us can still have the glories. Do I summarize that correctly?
Yes. So what he said most people to argue that we shouldn't give all of the unwashed masses their soma or their their virtual reality where they can live, laugh, love, do all these wonderful things that they can't do in the real world.
And they're not doing.
And he says it's reality privilege to deny them this access. I had white hot rage the first time I saw these remarks, and so what I ended up doing in the conclusion is talking about how this is where I think we have to defend the human. That is a deeply, deeply disturbing worldview to me.
It's dystopia.
It's dystopian science. It's Ready Player One. There's an entire plot of a dystopian science fiction novel about this kind of world where we all are plugged in. And I think that, for me, is not freedom. So I care deeply about freedom. And it's why it's such a happy home for me here at AEI, because everyone here cares about freedom. But that, to me, seems deeply unfree because it's outsourcing to, corporations, platforms, technology developers, world creation, living entirely in virtual reality. People might think, oh, that sounds nifty and fun. No, you're not in control of that universe. You do not have freedom. You do not have the same rights. You have a user. You're a user, not a citizen. You have user experiences, not human interactions. And I think that's where I get very
But it also
disturbed.
goes to sort of the banal, ugly, unpleasant, normal life was full of unpleasantlies and ugliness and terrible. And look, we've taken all that away, but it's those things that are what make life worth living.
Yes, this is the frictionless, right? The frictionless existence that Mark Zuckerberg wants to promise all of us. Friction is how friction's how you get any sort of resilience and fortitude and determination. And I think removing that, and again, to go back to the issue of kids, they need that too growing up. They need to experience frustration so that they can learn how to cope with it. And that's a process that starts very young. Delayed gratification. It's like the marshmallow test. Like we know, you want that kid to wait for that marshmallow. You don't want him to grab it and eat it right away. And that's again, worldviews have changed about whether that's useful or not.
Okay, a couple more. The easy one is work.
Yeah.
I mean, just the life of work with technology. Is it making us less collaborative?
It is in some cases. I mean, when we have, I worry about this, people not wanting to go back into an office because we have a lot of studies that show that collaboration happens and creativity happens when people bump into each other, talk by the water cooler. The water cooler effect is real, and we've lost that, especially in some of these big companies. I worry about the tracking being done actually at work. For a lot of people who don't have the option, they have to wear badges that can record. I mean, now the sensor badges, I have a chapter in there about some of the new sensor technology. It can record your heart rate, your breathing, all kinds of things that actually speak to your state of mind. So maybe you're in a boring meeting. You don't want your boss to know you're bored, but your badge is pinging HR going, boy, is she sick of this talk he's giving. And so that, again, there are things that we should have privacy and the right to keep hidden.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, now technology gets a big rap on our polarization in politics. Do you buy that?
Somewhat. I think some of the concerns about things like polarization, misinformation, disinformation have been overblown. I think that these platforms are not a really good way to have civil discussion about anything, and certainly not politics in a country that's very sharply divided and almost evenly divided, in terms of right and left. So in that sense, I think it's bad. I worry mainly about how we train younger generations in civic responsibility if they get all their news from TikTok, and they do get all their news from social media. They no longer read even the links on the news, the digital version of the newspaper. They just read the little, they watch a video, becoming a very a culture that doesn't actually want to do the deep dive.
This is so ironic to me, because the glory of technology in my daily life is that very easily I can quickly get through all of the major newspapers and the various. Yes. I can find out what's going on in the most rapid way possible. So isn't that ironic that they have this tool that allows you greater access to more information more rapidly, and yet people are using it to narrow their perspective?
Well, part of that, I think, goes back to how we the culture of reading, and that's been there's been a long-term, our education policy people know this much better than I do, but getting people to read at a very young age and being able to have the ability, whether you're reading on a screen or in print. I think print is still better for kids for a number of reasons. A number of studies have shown this. But just getting them to, again, that's a training. It's a habit of mind, and we are no longer training a lot of kids in those habits of mind.
What about our profession or your profession? I was a journalist a long time ago. Is journalism been affected by technology in a bad way?
Yes and no. I think social media has it's been a double-edged sword for a lot of journalists. On the one hand, we now see very clearly what their political biases are because they just put them all out there for everyone to see. So in that sense, there's a transparency that's good. On the other hand, there's also a kind of pushing the envelope to get a lot of attention because the platforms reward anger, fear, and hostility and anxiety. They don't reward puppies and kittens playing together and the lion laying down with the lamb and coming to some compromise. That's not rewarded. So journalists are part of this ecosystem where they want to get clicks for their articles. So the hyperbole effect is really encouraged by social media in particular, and I think it has changed journalism. One thing I will say, I love community. I'm not on social media, but I love community notes on X. This was the best instant fact-checking tool that has ever existed because someone puts a lie out there and community notes lets people weigh in on it in a way that's actually fairly democratic.
Well, wait a minute. You say you're not on social media. You must use search in Google.
I do. I search Google, but I'm not on any of the social media. I have no social media accounts.
How do you read your news?
So I get print subscriptions to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal.
I do too, but I also look at there's just
I look online,
broader.
Right? But I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on X. I'm not on
those
Facebook.
Social media.
No social media platforms.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and the last one I think is also true. And whenever so much of what we do is shallow. You don't get very deep into it, but in the academy is the place for the deep, the real mastering by a human of a hard topic.
Yeah.
And that requires a lot of sweat and deep time and effort and energy. And the reward from all of that is knowledge and academic excellence. And it's really wonderful when you get there. But I sometimes worry that this artificial intelligence is going to corrupt that, where no one really has to work that hard. Do you cover that in the book? A little bit. Most of the book was written before the big AI boom, which I do think is a little overblown in some realms. My concern is, I spent years in archives, traveling to archives as a grad student, living out of beans and cans. I stayed at some really weird, dodgy places in order to go to these archives. Weird is a funny word these days.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't say weird. Unusual places. And that, it taught me patience, because for every 100 pages of hard to decipher handwriting I would read through people's letters, there'd be one thing that actually would help me keep that thread going through what I was looking for, and I found lots of unusual things, but the patience it taught me and the delayed gratification and the humility. So I think what academic work used to really, particularly in the humanities, teach us is humility, to look at what people have done before us and say, my goodness, I acknowledge and admire what they've done, even if I don't agree with it. It's still it's our collective work as human beings, and I worry now that with AI is parasitic on that. AI comes in and takes everything that all these human beings have toiled and done, summarizes it, and gives you an answer in a split second. And a lot of people in the education space now will say, well, that's fine. It's a summary. And then you have to, you got to analyze it. No, the work matters. The work, it trains us in habits of mind and ways of seeing the world that require patience and humility. And I worry that AI will make that more challenging.
It's funny you say humility. Everyone loves humility. It's a great virtue. But I was just thinking of sweat and work and effort and toil.
It is those things
and
too. Yeah.
Those are things that are worth it. They are anyway, they add to the experience, and if you take all that away, then what is there?
Well, I'll tell you, I was speaking to someone at an AEI event last year, and he was arguing that he loved ChatGPT because his kids could learn to write so well, and he's describing how they would get ChatGPT to write a bunch of stuff, and then they would go through and then put their own ideas in and then turn it in. I said, well, they're editors. You're teaching them how to be editors. Writing is staring at that blank page, breaking out in a cold sweat and going, I have no idea what I'm going to say.
The writing is one of the big ones. I mean, I think if you don't really learn how to write, then you can't think.
Right.
And
that's correct.
If they give you a tool that makes so that you don't have to write, then you won't really be thinking. Okay, so now we've talked about all the problems and how awful it all is. I can't remember. Does the book have an answer? What do we do about it?
It does. I mean, I'm a historian. I'm going to tell you how to live sort of person. And every publisher wants give us some bullet point how tos.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not doing that. But I grudgingly sort of, in fact, inspired by my white hot rage at Mark Andreessen, I started thinking about okay, well, what would I say instead? And so my argument is that we need to start defending the human. And by that, I mean, we need to start defending the things that make us unique. The things that only we can do, and that evolution and humanity and our consciousness and our conscience and our institutions have trained us to do. And there are a lot of those things. So my ultimate conclusion is we should all be a little more Amish. So the Amish, they hate zippers. They only drive buggies and stuff. But so people have this stereotype of them. But the way they approach every new technology is quite compelling. They come together as a community and they say, do we want phones in our homes? Do we want a phone booth that the whole community can share that's out in a field? What's the benefit? What's the drawback? And they discuss it, and they really think through the implications. How will this disrupt our community? How will it disrupt how we behave every day? And they come to some agreement. So they don't entirely reject technology, although they still don't use zippers. But, there are ways in which they've integrated some technologies into their community, but first they have a discussion of values. So that's where I think...
Isn't there a reference to zippers and fear of flying?
Yes, there is. Totally different approach than the Amish, I would guess.
I could not. Now, 90% of our listeners probably don't know that reference, but you and I do.
Yes, well, we're of an age where we get that. But no, we should be more Amish. We should think about what are our values with regard to technology.
Yeah, but
what's
Christine,
disrupted by that.
What do you mean we? I mean, we're going to all get it together and decide we're not going to accept that. Doesn't sound. I don't hear a piece of legislation in that.
Oh, well, no, there's definitely, look, there's
what,
great stuff being done. We start with kids, and I think that's important. And we had John Haidt here to discuss his new book. A lot of the recommendations he makes, I totally approve of. We need to have enforceable age limits on social media use. That should absolutely, there's a lot of legislation coming down the pike with that. That's very good. It's bipartisan, too. This is a problem that
passed
I think...
the Senate, 94
exactly.
to 3.
So that's a good sign. Get cell phones, get all smartphones out of schools. No kid needs a smartphone during the day. And the teachers like that idea. The parents like it. The kids actually like it. And then as parents, keep those phones and the internet away from your kids as long as possible. There are lots of different parent movements. Wait until 8th, saying wait until parents get together.
How would it work? I get the no cell phones in school, and I got that. But age limits on social media, how actually does that work?
So the burden of proof needs to be on the tech companies who are already violating the law constantly, know how to make it work, and refuse to do it because they actually do want those kids captured at 8, 9, and 10 years old on Instagram. They don't care if they're self-harming either. They want them on that platform because they expect them to stay on it
Yeah, but
longer.
I'm still trying to, let's say you're 15 or 12 or 13, in between age. You pick up a phone.
So there are all kinds of tools that are being explored.
that could prevent that child from
Yes,
being
there's a
able
horrifying app which I've tried where you take a picture of your face and it tells you your age. It's scarily accurate. It's very it's rather unnerving. But there are all kinds of tools. We have the tools to
Couldn't
do it.
get you
Look,
correctly.
we
Would get
oh
you
yes,
wrong.
oh yes, it did. I was like, I'm actually a year younger than that. I must have been tired that day. But that we have the tools, and people will subvert them just like they subvert having to be 21 to get
Okay,
alcohol.
so you're saying technology can solve this problem of keeping kids off of social
we
media.
have tools for that. But we need the will to enforce the law, and that means punishing the platforms that knowingly allow kids on them.
Okay, so there are things we can do
Yes.
to regain our humanity.
Yes.
Well, I hope so, because I'm a little worried. I really am. I do worry that it's a little bit of sort of old fuddy-duddy. You young people are ruining your life.
He's looking at you two in the
Yeah.
studio here.
But the Dan Cox stuff about what's
Yes.
happening in relationships,
Yeah.
I do think the technology plays a role in that.
Definitely.
And okay, anything else you want to tell us about the book, the writing of the book, the marketing of the book, what it was like to, how happy, just what else? Anything else you want to say?
It was I have to thank all my colleagues in social cultural constitutional studies. We have this monthly meeting where we read each other's works in progress, and I got a huge amount of really wonderful feedback from them back when I was drafting the book. It's a real community here that helped me, and we have a lot of enthusiastic technology types here at AEI, and they're always pushing back on me when
a lot of libertarians.
Yes, a ton of libertarians.
A lot of great friends of Mark Andreessen.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so I have appreciated being in a community where my ideas get challenged all the time. It makes it better. So I've really enjoyed that. That made the writing of this book really a wonderful experience for me.
Okay. Well, I really can't wait till it's out and everybody else can read it the way I have. And
you can pre-order on Amazon.
Yeah, you can pre-order on
supposed to
the
say that all the
Extinction
time.
of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. I guess I'd ask one more question, sir. I always like to ask people where this fits in the literature. And you mentioned Jonathan Haidt.
Mm-hmm.
He's done a book on this topic as well.
Yes.
How would you differentiate yourself from other contributions to the literature in this field?
Well, he's talking about kids, and so I have some examples with children in the book, but mine's about us it's more about adults. It's more about worldview formation, habits of mind. In a way, you've all told me it's actually a book about the need for more virtue in the world, which makes it a very conservative book in some ways. But the message is really it's more in the tone of like Christopher Lasch. So there's a bit of it that's a lament, but I'm not entirely pessimistic because I can see areas where we're starting to acknowledge what's happening and think about changing our behavior.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll stop, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Christine Rosen.
Thank you.